This is the shoulder region of my character, and I'm just going to upload the image of that particular character so you could see what I'm working with. The next section of this particular assignment is UV mapping, and when it comes to UV mapping, we just want to make sure that we have an idea of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Since we are UV mapping in Maya and then exporting our objects in a Mudbox, it's really important to make sure our UV maps are properly laid out, and to identify with what objects are going to be round in our scene and which objects are going to be a hard edge. Okay, so again, I added edge loops to the objects that I wanted to keep hard edge. Okay, as you can see around this particular shape, right? I added edge loops around this particular object so that it doesn't round off too much in Mudbox. And the same thing with this shape. When I press 3 on it, this is exactly what I should expect it to be like in Mudbox when I add a higher level of sculpting detail. Since we are sculpting in Mudbox and painting in Mudbox, again, I'll reiterate that it's really important that we keep the edges hard on our objects by using the insert edge loop tool on the edges of our object. So first thing about UV mapping is that it is very time consuming, very painful at times, but I found out that you can get really good results by using the automatic map. If I go to UV and then go to UV editor, this is what my UVs look like right now. It doesn't resemble anything of this geometry. So I'm going to go to UV, automatic, and immediately, let me make this the size of my screen. Immediately you're going to notice, let me go to object mode on here. You're going to notice that this is the same shape of all my objects. Now, I want to paint a really high quality texture on this object. So this square that you see is what we call our UV space. Okay? Now imagine applying a 500 by 500 pixel image to this particular object. I'm not going to get all 500 by 500 resolution on, let's say, the front of this piece of geometry. It will actually probably be a quarter of that. So you can imagine this shape being textured at 500 by 500 resolution in this UV space. It's going to be very pixelated. So what I like to do, especially for the larger items, okay, I like to scale them up as large as I can in this UV space. So these are smaller items that I'm going to move outside of my UV space and then put them back in. So if you right mouse click and hold, go to shell, you can highlight all of those items, and I'm just going to move them to the left. Alright, all of these smaller items, I'm going to move them to the left. And I want to identify if that's, okay, this is a front. And so I'm moving this UV shape. I'm going to rotate it. This is a back UV here. And I'm thinking about stacking these two on top of each other. So I want to flip this like that and then rotate it. So let me go back into object mode so you can see my UVs. Alright, so there you go. See, I'm just kind of like stacking those UVs. Alright. So now I'm going to select this shell. So right mouse click and hold, go to shell. And I'm going to scale these guys up as large as I can without them going outside of the border of my UV. And now everything else is kind of like fitting those other objects into the scene. Now, I know that this round shape here is the front of that object. Okay? And these are all of the tiny little pieces that make up the insides of objects. So I'll put these guys back in here. And I'm actually going to stack these like in a square pattern so that I can optimize the space in my UV editor. You never want to have your UVs overlapping each other, right? See, it's like a square shape. You never want to have your UVs overlapping each other, otherwise when you start to paint your texture maps, it's not going to turn out the way you want them to be. Alright, so I'll move this here, and I'll zoom out. I'll select these UVs here, these guys, and I'll scale them up. Move them here. And take these guys and move them over. Maybe I could put them right there. Press R, scale them up a little more. Take these guys here, and I'm trying to optimize the space, because remember, the larger our UVs in our UV editor, the more detail that we can get from our texture maps. Alright, it's kind of like Tetris. So let me go back into object mode and you can see how my UVs are right now. Alright. Now I could go to shell, I'll select that shell. I could scale this up and put it right here. Again, I'm trying to make sure that the UVs aren't overlapping. Okay. I can rotate that. Press R, scale it up. Now, some of you guys will have way more complex pieces than what I have, but it's the same concept. All right, maybe I'll take this piece and rotate it like this, and then flip it. See, so there's really no, I mean, there's a little bit of a process. And of course I can change my mind at any time, like I'm doing now. But again, the concept is to keep your UVs from overlapping each other and optimizing the UV space. So now you can see that I've just created so much more space for myself inside my UV editor. And what I'm going to do now is, let's see here. Let's take this guy, put him here, take these guys, I'll rotate it a little bit, like that. I'll take this one, and then I can flip my UVs by using this or that one. changes the position. Press E to rotate. I'll do that. Now, I'm running into a little bit of an issue here. You could see that my UVs are overlapping right down here. So if I wanted to, I could select, right mouse click and hold, go to UV, select those UVs, and split them. Right? I could split them by clicking on this icon here. So it actually separates the UV map, and I can go to shell, and now that piece is separate. You see? Oh. So now, here we go. So you're wondering, all right, there's a lot of space here. So now I can take these guys, move them here, and scale them up a little bit more. So now I can get a lot more detail from this UV map. And I'll go into my object mode, and there you go. That's my UV map, and I can use this UV space as a 1K map, or a 2K map, or a 4K map. Alright, so let me close this. If I right mouse click and hold and go to assign new material and add a Lambert to it, and in that Lambert I'm going to actually, let's delete some history first. So edit, delete by type history, and then find my Lambert 2. I'll assign a checker pattern to it, and then when I press 6 you can see that checker pattern. Now probably wondering, like, that doesn't look like a perfect square shape, but if I go into my UV editor and turn the checker pattern off, if I select my shell, highlight everything in here, and scale it up extremely large, alright, if I scale this up extremely large in my UV editor, you're going to notice that that square pattern is actually really nice. Okay, the UV, doing the automatic map, it separates everything perfectly. Alright, so let me press Z to undo. And I'm going to send this object over into Mudbox. Before I do that, I'm going to save it as UV arm _01. Okay, so when I send this over to Mudbox and I start to sculpt it, when I press 3, you're going to see I'm not going to lose a whole lot of detail in my character's arm. It's going to keep the same shape, and that's because I added the Insert Edge Loop tool. So let me break the connection of that checker pattern. I'll select this object and go to File, Send to Mudbox as New Scene. Okay, so just waiting for it to load. Alright, so there's my object in Mudbox. First thing I like to do is to right mouse click and hold, go to Edit Material, and change the specular color to black. Alright, because I want to paint a specular color to this. Now this geometry looks the same way it does in Maya when I press 1. Alright, in order for me to add any sort of scratches or a displacement map to it, I need to create a sculpt layer. Alright, and the way I create a sculpt layer is going to the upper right side of Mudbox. Okay, click on sculpt, and I'm going to click on new layer. I always like to have a sculpt layer created when this is at a level of 1. Alright, now I'm going to create another sculpt layer after I increase the subdivisions on this guy. So you can see the wireframe on here. The moment I press and hold Shift and press D, you can see that it increased. You see in the upper right hand corner the level I've gone from 3 to 4, and now I'm adding more subdivisions. So right now I have 2.2 million faces on here. Alright. Now, depending on the level of detail you want on this particular object is going to be the level that we create. So this is my sculpt level 1, and I'm going to create another sculpt level. Alright. If you want to add, let's say, a metal pattern on here, I can go to my sculpt tools and then click on my sculpt tool. Alright, that's my sculpt tool. Alright. Now, I'm just going to find any sort of random metal texture that they have here. Alright. I'll click on front camera, and I'm going to press and hold S. Right mouse click and hold to change the size of this. Hold S and middle mouse button to move that stencil. Hold S and left mouse click to rotate it. Now if I want it to repeat this particular tile, I'm going to click on my stencil, and on the right side of the screen it says use tiles. Now I know that this particular tile, the edges don't line up like perfectly, like right here it does, but in this section they don't align perfectly, so maybe use tiles is not a good thing with this particular texture. I personally would find my textures online, but for the sake of this tutorial I'm just going to turn that off, and I'll put this here. Now I'm actually going to go to my object list and click right mouse click on front camera and go to look through selected, and there's my object, but it looks as though I need to go to my side camera. And where are you at? Okay, but this looks like the, okay, that's the front of my object. Now I actually want to lock this camera so I don't accidentally zoom in or zoom out. So that empty space to the word side, I'm going to click on that, and there's a lock. So now I can't zoom in or out.
Wow, this is amazing.
Alright, so now if I click on my stencil, I'll hold S, drag it, I'll move it here, and if I click on this guy, you can see that it's starting to change the surface of my geometry. Alright, now the issue with this obviously is that the surface is being distorted a little too much because the strength is too high. So I'll press Control Z or Command Z. Alright, let's go back. Alright, there we go. And I'm going to dial the strength down of my sculpt tool. So if you click on your sculpt tool, it'll bring up your size and the strength. Okay. Now I personally like to hold B, left mouse click and drag to change the brush size, and if I hold M, left mouse click and drag, I can change the strength of the sculpt tool. So now with my stencil selected, let me change the size of this. I'll go back to my side camera, look through, and you can see that I'm starting to paint that pattern on here. Alright? Now one thing that you will notice is that that pattern or the texture on here is starting to get, I don't know, the quality. Alright? Let me go back into my perspective. You can see that the quality of that particular sculpt is not the best, and that's because the resolution or the subdivisions aren't small enough to get all of that detail. So with that being said, I'm just going to step back, Command Z, go back into my layers list, and you can see my layers list, it says level 4. I'm actually going to increase that sculpt layer. So I'll press and hold Shift, I'll press D. So now I'm at level 5. So now I have 9 million polygons. If I press Shift D one more time, sometimes machines might not be able to hold that many. Now I have 36 million polygons, and that surface is ready to be sculpted on. But you're going to notice that this sculpt layer here at sculpt level 4 will not allow me to sculpt on it. So I have to create another sculpt layer. And I think it's always important to rename this, so I'll call this metal, what is it, diamond? Metal diamond. And I can click on here and I can see the word. All right. If you press Q, you can bring your stencil back. You can hide it. Okay. So let's look at it from here. I'll move my stencil to this region. And now when I click and drag, I get a much higher level of sculpt. Say much better, but it's not a word I'd like to use for this. Alright, so every time I click and drag over this sculpt, it's going to continually raise that geometry. Alright, so I would be very careful about how many times you go over that particular sculpt. Alright. Alright, so let's try it just one time. Clicking and dragging, and I'm moving this over that surface. Alright, and now what I can do is I'll stop sculpting here. I'll press Q to hide that, and you can see now that I have a higher level of detail in that sculpt. Now my layer here says strength 100. So I can click on that strength 100 and I can dial this down and change the height of that sculpt layer. You see? I can change the height of that sculpt layer. Now the cool thing with using our sculpt layer is that we can use it in conjunction with our paint tools. So let me show you exactly what I'm referring to. If I go to my side camera, I look through, I'm going to move my stencil tool to this particular section. Alright, let me move it right here. And I'm going to paint the stencil here. Again, my camera is set up in a position where I can't move it. So I'm going to paint this stencil on the surface. Alright, just like that. You can see the surface being modified. Alright. And now I'm going to stop with this extrusion. Okay. And click on the paint tools. And now I'm going to click on the projection map. Alright, so the projection map will actually paint onto our surface. So I'm going to go to layers, and I'm going to click on that little plus sign here. Alright, this is going to create a new paint layer. I'm going to rename this to metal diamond. The image size, I think for this part of my character, I don't want it to be a 4K map, but I'll change it to a 2K map. It'll be a diffuse, save as TIFF, and I'll press OK. So now it's creating that sculpt layer, and now I can paint directly on top of my sculpt. You see? I can paint directly on top of my sculpt. So now I have my diffuse map. I have my diffuse map. I also have my sculpt map, and I'm happy with that. So I press Q, and there we go. Alright, let's go back into my perspective. And what you're noticing here on my texture is a little bit of stretching. Alright, you see a stretching right here? And the way that we avoid the stretching is that we have to go back into Maya and we have to really ensure that our UV maps are nice. So you can see my UV maps are perfectly laid out. I go to 3D view and I'll go to layer. I could turn this off. And I'll teach you how to prevent that stretching after painting, but I want to show you the process of exporting an EXR file, which is the displacement map. So I'll go to UV maps, extract texture maps, new operation. I'm going to click on displacement map. I'm going to click on the base file name, that little dot here, and send this Mech Warrior into my source images folder. And I'm going to call this metal displacement. Change the files of type to open EXR 16-bit. Press save. And we're going to turn the anti-aliasing to 6. The image size is going to be 2K. And then we'll click extract. So what we're doing is taking all of this displacement, right, taking all that geometry, and we're going to assign it to this really low poly model in Maya. And when we do that, and when we render, you're going to see all of that geometry displaced on this low poly model. Alright, so there's no way that we could generate 36 million faces in Maya on this particular object. And that's why we have what we call displacement maps. So the extraction map is finished. Now click close. And while I'm at it, I'll click on my paint layer, right? And we're going to extract our diffuse map. So right mouse click on here, export selected. I'll go to my folder, and I will call this metal underscore diffuse, or metal, yeah, we'll call it metal diffuse. I'll change the files type to target, save. Alright, perfect. I'll minimize Mudbox. And now we're going to, first of all, create a light source so we can see exactly what we're doing. Alright, so I'll go to my Arnold. Let me turn it on. So Windows, Settings / Preferences, Plugin Manager. I'll turn Arnold on. Let's see, M to A. Auto load, close. I'll go to Arnold and I'll click on the Sky Dome Light. I'll select my objects and I'll add a new material, AI shader, and I'll go to the Arnold tab, Arnold render view, and then there's my objects, right? Okay, so we're going to add a displacement map to this low poly geometry, and with this object selected, I'm going to go to Windows, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, and in my Hypershade, I'm going to go ahead and graph that geometry. So that's the inputs, outputs. You can see my AI standard, it's my object. Okay. So this guy. Alright. So now actually with this object selected, let's see here. It's my AI standard. I'm going to select a different AI standard for the other pieces of geometry because I don't want them all to share the same AI standard. Assign you AI standard. I'll make it kind of glossy. Okay. So with this object selected, I'll go back in my graph editor. Let's graph this. And I'm going to go to my 2D textures. I'll click File. It's my file. I'll click on the file. And I'm going to upload the MechWarrior source images, my metal diffuse, my metal displacement. Press open. And I'm going to click on my AI standard. And then I'm going to middle mouse drag my file to the displacement material. And let's give ourselves a quick render after we click on our displacement shader. And let's go to Arnold, render view. Now you're going to notice that this geometry just like exploded, right? It's because we have to change the scale of our displacement shader. Alright? So I have the displacement shader selected. I'll change the scale to 0.5. Let's change it to 0.05. And we'll allow it to load. It's a little bit too big, so we'll change it to 0.02. And give it a few seconds. Change the scale to 0.01. I think we're starting to get some detail on this image. So actually the bell is getting ready to ring, and there's a few more little bit of details that I need to add to this particular model to get the displacement map to act properly. If I select this geometry, go to the Arnold tab, I have to change the subdivisions from none to Cat Clark, and then increase the iterations to like 4. and it actually is going to smooth out our geometry in our render view, right? Because Arnold works different than like Mental Ray. In Mental Ray, you press 3, you're going to see your object smooth out. So there's a few other adjustments that we need to make to our displacement map to get the right results. So we'll continue that in the next tutorial.